All right. Good afternoon, five-star real estate agents, and welcome to the Deal Doctor live stream episode. Welcome, agents. Welcome to the live stream episode. We're going to be talking a little bit today about mineral rights and the history. What are mineral rights? So let me jump right in to the mineral rights and give you a little bit of history about how these came about. Now, there was a Michigan state geologist. His name was Alexander Winchell, was the first to report the presence of oil and natural gas back in 1860. Now, the first oil was discovered in Saginaw, of all places, in 1925. And in 1928, Mount Pleasant's oil field helped that city to become the oil capital of Michigan. So there was a report from 2019 from Michigan Department of Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy, which is Eagle. They're stating that currently Michigan, again from the report in October of 2019, that Michigan was the 12th largest natural gas producer and the 17th largest crude oil producer in the U.S. Now, the abundant mineral rights resources protected Michigan from much of the Great Depression. So there is currently a lot of major oil and gas fields in Michigan that are mapped out. We have Beaver Creek Field, East Norwich, Enterprise, Rich, Rose City, Springdale, Walker, White River, and there's a lot of active oil and gas companies throughout Michigan, just to name a few: Dart Oil and Gas, Howard Energy, Jordan Development, Merritt Energy, Muskegon Development, Summit Petroleum, to name a few. It goes on and on. And uh, a large number of aggregate companies who go out there and want to see whether property would contain any type of sand, gravel for cement purposes. But I want to dive in a little bit here uh, and give you some background on the importance of mining in the mineral rights. So, with regards to Michigan's economy for over 125 years, I mean, if we were to look at what Michigan has done, the production has totaled about $50 billion since the mid 1990s when it comes to mining in Michigan. And the average is around 2.5 billion annually. That's what's really going on here. So it's $1 billion business. So it is profitable for companies that are out there trying to do mining. Now, we are one of only two states in the nation that mine iron ore for the steel industry, and the only state that produces nickel and cobalt, which is interesting. We produce significant amounts of cement, lime, stone and sand and gravel, much of which is exported through the Great Lakes. And if we were to look at Michigan's historical copper and silver production, it's worth about $60 billion at today's prices. And the exploration for new deposits currently is continuing throughout the state of Michigan. We do have large reserves of salt and potash that will almost certainly be mined in the future throughout the state, as well as potential for large discoveries of critical minerals that have been identified recently in the federal government. Now, again, mining takes place in all the counties of the state and supplies essential material for manufacturing, construction, and other basic uh, economic activities. Now, there's a couple different types of minerals, and they fall into different types of categories. Uh, when we're talking about mineral rights, we have ferrous metals, which are minerals mined primarily for their iron content, non-ferrous, which are those that are metals that don't contain any iron. We have industrial minerals, which are non-metallic, such as sand and gravel, limestone, gypsum, and salt. That seems to be the big ones here, as well as fuel minerals, which is the coal, oil, and natural gas. So I kind of spell those out because when people think mineral, I think so many times we just go right to coal. Oh, I'm sorry, we go right to the oil and gas mineral rights. But we deal with a lot of salt here, gypsum, sand, and aggregate, gravel. So a lot of people will say, well, what are mineral rights? Well, a mineral right is a right to extract a mineral from the earth or to receive a payment in the form of a royalty. So it's really for the extraction of minerals. That's what a mineral right is. It gives you the right to extract uh, a mineral from the earth. And we just talked about the different types of minerals: ferrous, non-ferrous, the categories industrial minerals, and fuel minerals. Now, a lot of times we'll ask, well, who owns the mineral rights for a parcel of land? Let's say we go and we list a parcel, and someone says, well, do you own the mineral rights? Well, the client might say, I don't know. So let me dive in here a little bit about who owns the mineral rights for a parcel of land. Now, we have to understand that a mineral right is a property right, and that property right may be sold, transferred, or leased. So mineral rights are distinct from surface rights, or the right to use the surface of the land for residential, agricultural, recreational, commercial, or other purposes. Now, keep in mind that mineral rights may be sold or retained separately from the surface rights, in which case the mineral rights are said to be severed. So that's the term we're looking at, that when we go to someone, typically everyone will have the surface rights to do what they want on the very top of the property, but we're dealing with the mineral rights, the ability to extract something from the ground. And there are different mining techniques that people can extract minerals from. They can build shafts and go down into it. A lot of times what we'll see are they use water and they do it like a brine, and they extract out salt, or they extract out other minerals, and then you have this salt brine mixture, this water that they have to reprocess or extract out the minerals from that salt brine. Uh, so there's multiple different methods for companies to use. Again, oil and gas, natural gas, with pipelines and wells and whatnot. But when we sever the mineral rights from a property by either being sold or transferred or leased, we need to know that as agents, because now we have not only the property that we're selling, but we're also selling now or assigning a lease that someone else or that the current seller owns, or they're holding on to. So a person can own all of the mineral rights for a parcel or any fraction of the rights. We can even carve out certain rights. We could say that the seller only wants to retain the oil and natural gas rights and sell the aggregate, lime, salt, and anything else that's in the property. A person can also own the rights to only one kind of mineral, like I said, such as oil and gas, or only to a or only one formation or depth interval. So maybe they only want to own up to 20 feet of the ground underneath them, and the rest they're going to retain for whoever or to the next buyer. So how do I find out who owns the mineral rights to my property in Michigan? That tends to come up quite often because a lot of times the sellers don't know whether they own the rights. So mineral right ownership information can be found with the Register of Deeds in the county where the land is located. And you can do that by examining the deed abstract for the property. Now, a lot of times when we're reading these deed abstracts, we might not truly understand what they're saying. We may need to have more expertise, someone who understands how to read these and convey what's being kept with the current owners. Uh, so a lot of times we recommend contacting your local title company and asking if they perform mineral rights searches, since this typically is an additional expense. Not all title companies offer it, or they may have to refer you to another title company to do that portion of the review of title to see whether the seller still truly owns the mineral rights or not. Now, people will say, well, do mineral rights ever expire? Well, every mineral right agreement is different. So there's not just one way of conducting mineral rights. However, most mineral right agreements can last anywhere from 2 to 20 years. So there is typically a primary and sometimes a secondary term for mineral right leases that determines mineral rights expiring depending on if any drilling has occurred. So if there hasn't been any drilling, there are factors that we need to follow, which I don't want to get into here. Again, I'm just trying to do basics for understanding about what questions might come up for us as agents when we have sellers uh, that have mineral rights that they want to carve out. Now, some people will ask, well, is mining legal in Michigan? And mining for metal ore in the state of Michigan requires that the mine operator have a permit from the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, which has the authority to set permit conditions and supervise the operation of the mine. So we just need to be understand. We need to understand what is it that we need to let our client be aware of if they actually don't own their mineral rights or if they do. And if there's going to be active mining, that's once they buy this property, let's say you represent a buyer, um, is there going to be active mining that comes onto there? So what you need to know is this, is when you represent a seller, what is it that that seller wants? And this is a conversation. Now, if they own the mineral rights, do they just want to sell the mineral rights with the property? If they don't, they're going to need to carve those out. Uh, and it might mean that the property isn't as valuable to a future buyer. A buyer may say, you know what, I don't want to deal with buying a property, uh, then having a separate agreement for the mineral rights, not knowing what an oil or gas company is going to do to come in. And it can be frustrating, I think, for a buyer to want to have to deal with that. Whereas with the seller, they don't care. They just keep the mineral rights, and maybe they're getting royalties. Maybe they're getting a monthly payment. But it's really going to depend on if you're a seller and you want to, let's say they want to lease out their mineral rights that they own to an oil company. And it's really going to depend on the oil company. They're going to come and, or the aggregate company. Let me go off track here a little bit. I represented a seller, let's say on a 300-acre parcel. We were approached by aggregate companies who wanted to come out and drill 20 different boreholes down into the soil. They wanted to verify how much sand or how much aggregate or lime or any other mineral was in there for them to be able to make a determination on how much money they might give that seller. It could have been per year. It could have been a royalty if they were to extract large sums of this out of the ground. It could have been turned into a gravel pit for all I know. But we need to be but the seller would have needed to be careful because if he was going to do that and then he tried to sell it, well, I don't know if maybe the buyer would want to buy a property that in the backyard was a partial gravel pit. So we always encourage folks to talk to an attorney, understand uh, what's going to happen if they end up signing an agreement between a company to give up their mineral rights. Right now, a lot of people just end up selling the mineral rights along with the property and really don't think about um, any much more about the mineral rights. But if you do have a seller who wants to retain those mineral rights, there's going to need to be, or maybe, for example, I had a situation on that same 300-acre parcel where the seller just wanted to keep the oil and gas, natural gas rights, but wanted to sell all other mineral rights. So we had to go down the process of hiring an attorney. We had to understand between the buyer and the seller what consideration was going to be given. So basically meaning the buyer and seller would each agree to receive a good and valuable consideration to enter into the agreement. And maybe that was just a conveyance of a promise of what both parties were going to, how they were going to perform on future mineral extractions. We had to agree on the easements in gross, that the buyer was going to grant perpetual easement to the seller because the seller may end up granting the oil and gas rights to another company, so that other company would then need to have access to the property. So an easement agreement to from the buyer to the seller would have needed to be drafted so that we had right of way and access to locations for drilling. We need both parties would have needed to agree on well sites, the location of the wells, the flow lines, the pipelines, and any access roads to the drilling sites. Uh, Parties would need to agree on the roads. Buyer and seller would need to seek mutually agreement upon where are we going to place the road. And if we did, and if the uh, seller who was leasing out the oil and gas rights, so here you have a buyer sitting there, and all of a sudden there's trucks coming on the property. Well, first of all, they would need to get permission for construction of the new road that would need to be required to enter onto the property and to a certain location. Uh, we would need to ensure that our agreement already in advance had an agreement on how close these roads would be or how many yards away that road would have to be to any residential structure, barns, or bodies of water. Maybe it would be 100 yards because if you're a buyer, all of a sudden you have a road with these big trucks going right next to you 20 feet all day and night. Well, wow, you're going to be pretty miserable buyer because you don't own the oil and gas mineral rights. And now you have these big companies just coming in all day long. So it's always important to spell out if someone's going to keep mineral rights or even sell, if they're going to keep mineral rights and the buyer's going to buy, but certain mineral rights will be excluded. What does that contract look like? Because that buyer really needs to know what they're getting into. We even had to negotiate gates uh, that the seller would provide gates on the roads that it constructs. Uh, we had to talk about trees. So in this case, the seller was going to keep the oil and gas mineral rights, but tree, what would happen if the seller came in and they had to put roads in and we had to cut trees down? So we had to negotiate a reimbursement to the buyer for any tree removal, saplings or seedings or seedlings uh, that may have been destroyed to create that road. We had to talk about what trees would be removed or what wouldn't, at what diameter. I think we had agreed that trees of 4 inches in diameter or more shall be cut into log lengths and shall be stacked along the right of way and shall remain the property of the buyer. So again, when we cut the trees, those trees aren't the seller's anymore. I mean, that wood is a right of the buyer's surface, but the seller still needed to come in along with the oil and gas companies and create roads. So anytime they came in and destroyed some property, well, the buyer was going to be compensated. So we had to actually determine uh, what value lumber would be at the time. We had to determine uh, maintenance or use of any area for the wells equal to blank dollars per acre for timber consideration. Uh, I ended up doing research and determining that we ended up using Michigan Department of Natural Resources Forest Management Division, where they had a kind of a formula that we could use for determining timber pricing. We had to negotiate soil grading and erosion issues, restoration of the property if the oil companies came in, maintenance of the property, produced water, where we said no surface discharge of produced water shall be permitted on the premises without buyer's consent. Water wells and water usage. We talked about the seller may drill and maintain water wells on the premises to conduct drilling. Seller shall pay buyer blank dollars per drilled foot for drilling water and blank dollars per barrel for all other water used for any other purposes. So on this property, we had a couple natural springs, and we wanted to ensure that, hey, if these companies were coming in, that the new buyer was going to be compensated for any use of the water. Plus, there's also other federal guidelines for water usage that would have had to been followed anyway. But there's repairs right away, well site repairs compensation. There's payments. So if someone puts up a road, buyer, how much are you going to get for that? Because maybe that property is no longer useful. Pipeline payments would be another one. If someone had to construct a pipeline on it, uh, the seller shall pay buyer the sum of blank dollars per foot of pipeline for the use of that property. So, well site locations, another one, jurisdictions, recordings of this. Again, these types of agreements, you definitely want to make sure that there's a memorandum that's recorded in the Register of Deeds for it. Um, so I know I went way down the rabbit hole on that, but I just want to let people understand that if you have a seller who wants to maintain mineral rights or certain mineral rights, and you have a buyer that comes on board, there better be an agreement or understanding in there about what is that the seller's keeping. If the seller's keeping all of the rights, then okay, you still need some type of uh, document drafted by an attorney so that the buyer understands that they're not getting the mineral rights on that. Here's a question that comes up. Uh, a question here from someone says, is there a time after which mineral rights revert to the landowner if they haven't been asserted by the rights of owners? So yeah, currently what we're looking at is a lot of these mineral rights can last from 2 to 20 years, and typically after 20 years they can expire and revert back to the land owner. But there's a lot of different caveats there, and that's just not I don't want to say this, yeah, that always happens because if there's active drilling or if something happened, it may extend those and it doesn't automatically then revert back. Again, I don't have enough knowledge to actually say or give you a specific answer on that. I would refer that back to the Michigan Department of Environmental, Great Lakes and Energy, and some of the mining companies or an attorney to look at those to understand more. So but I do appreciate the question. Another question that I get all the time is my seller has a mineral rights lease on the property. Can I list the home? And that's a great question. Um, yes, you can list the home, but the mineral rights uh, need to be treated as a separate transaction or remain with the seller. So if a seller is carving out all of the mineral rights, that's simple. If the seller is deciding that they only want to carve out certain portions of mineral rights, you definitely need to get an attorney because we need to understand what it is that the seller is going to keep and what mineral rights are going to be conveyed to the new buyer because we need to record that document so that we understand what the seller is keeping and what the buyer is going to retain or what the buyer is going to be buying. The problem when a seller decides to want to keep or carve out some mineral rights is we need an attorney. And again, all those topics that I just talked about will then that seller will need to sit down with an attorney and address all of those questions on how to uh, repay the buyer if an oil company all of a sudden comes in and needs construction of roads, puts in wells, and that's where that huge list of easement considerations, well sites, roads, gates, trees, soil, restoration, maintenance, produced water, repairs. It's a long process that needs to be addressed by the seller. And normally we'd like to see that done before you even go to list because it can take months of a process to understand what it is. And sometimes once the sellers go down this path, uh, their heads are spinning and they throw their hands up and say, heck with it. I don't, I'm just going to sell the mineral rights with the property because this is a little too much than what I wanted to get into. So what I normally would encourage agents that one, if you do know that your client has mineral rights and they have an active lease or even an expired lease, you should really retain a copy, get a copy of that and read it, understand it. I mean, what mineral rights are being leased would be the question. And does the seller want to assign the lease to the new buyer? Now, the seller can either keep the mineral rights or upon closing, we can have that lease assigned to the new buyer. Now, that should be drafted in the purchase agreement about what's going to happen with the mineral rights and whether they're going to retain with the seller or if this lease will be transferred to the new buyer. We then would also want to call the company who uh, is the leasee, let them know that there's going to be a transfer of the leaseor or the owner so that they can prep and prepare for a transfer of that document, that lease. And a lot of times the oil companies will just send over a one-page document transferring ownership from one party to the other. But again, that should be addressed in the purchase agreement so that both buyers and sellers are aware of what's being transferred and what's going to remain with the seller. Um, and if we want to, we can always put that lease as an exhibit within the purchase agreement so that we understand what's being conveyed or what's not going to be uh, conveyed from buyer to seller. And again, when in doubt, each party should seek the advice of their attorney to fully understand all their options when buying property without mineral rights or understanding a lease that is being assigned from the seller to the new buyer. Um, Again, I know this is just more of a brief scenario, but I really just kind of wanted to have the agents understand that when you're dealing with mineral rights, how in-depth a contract can become and how complicated it can become for a seller to want to carve out certain mineral rights. It's just not as easy as, yep, I'm going to keep the mineral rights. Well, if they want to keep them all, that's fine. But again, they're still going to need to have some type of contract drafted by their attorney, and so that the buyer is aware that hey, that they're not buying the mineral rights. So that would need to be recorded as well with the county. So I hope that if there are any further questions about mineral rights or how to negotiate these or give broker support a call, give me a call. Otherwise, this concludes today's live stream. If you have any questions, again, please reach out to broker support. We'd be love to help you in any way we can. Other than that, have a great weekend, everyone. Thank you so much. Take care.